An alien empire sent Earth one message: prepare your champions. The battle begins in 7 days. Somewhere between translation and terror, one word got mixed up, and humanity built a stadium instead of an army. If you like a good laugh before the chaos, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. Because in 7 days, the deadliest empire in the galaxy is about to walk into the wrong party. Let's begin this journey. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, which felt insulting on its own. It came through every radio, television, and phone screen on the planet at the exact same second, in a voice that sounded like gravel being read poetry. Species of Earth, you have been chosen. Your world has drawn the attention of the Drenic Dominion. In 7 of your rotations, you will send your champions to the trial grounds. Prepare well. Glory awaits the worthy. Then the signal cut out, and the entire planet lost its mind for about 6 hours. Colonel Jake Harrison was 3 sips into his coffee at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado when the alert came through. He was 51 years old, built like a man who still ran 5 miles before breakfast, and he had exactly 0 patience for surprises before 9 in the morning. By the time he reached the command center, 3 generals, 2 senators, and a translator from the Department of Defense were already arguing about what the word trial actually meant. Dr. Emily Sanders was the one who finally got everyone to sit down. She was the lead linguist on the First Contact Response Team, a job that had existed for exactly 1 day and already felt like too much responsibility for one person. She replayed the message for the 4th time, isolating the alien phrase that had been translated as trial grounds. It also translates as arena of trials, she said, or grounds of challenge. Some versions lean toward competition, some lean toward combat. Which one is it? Harrison asked. Sanders rubbed her eyes. Colonel, their language does not separate those 2 ideas. To them, competition and combat are the same word. That should have been the moment everything went right. Instead, it became the moment everything went sideways, because 3 floors above them, a public relations officer named Danny Cruz had already leaked the word trial grounds to a reporter. And by lunchtime, every network on the planet was calling it the Interstellar Games. Nobody corrected them, partly because nobody wanted to admit they weren't sure. Partly because the alternative explanation sounded like something out of a nightmare, and admitting that out loud felt like it might make it true. Within 48 hours, the United Nations had approved funding for what they officially named the Ascension Festival, a global event to select Earth's finest athletes to represent the planet. Stadiums were repurposed, broadcast towers were rebuilt. A retired Olympic Committee chairman was pulled out of retirement and handed a budget the size of a small country's economy. Harrison sat in on exactly one of these planning meetings before he stood up, slammed his hand on the table, and said the sentence that would later be quoted in exactly 0 official documents. We are preparing snacks for an alien invasion. Nobody listened. The problem was simple, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. The translation software used for the initial message was built for trade negotiations and diplomatic greetings. It had never been designed to parse a warrior culture's idea of glory. Every word that could mean tournament also meant war. Every phrase that could mean champion also meant executioner. And the humans, desperate for a version of the future that did not end in fire, had chosen to believe the friendlier translation. Harrison requested access to raw military intelligence, the kind gathered from deep space listening posts that had, for decades, quietly recorded chatter from beyond the solar system. What he found made his stomach drop. Scattered references to the Drenic Dominion appeared across 3 different alien communication intercepts, all translated independently by different systems, and all of them agreed on one detail. The Drenic never lost a trial, not because they were unbeatable, because losing meant the entire species stopped existing. He brought this information to the president's chief of staff, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel Simmons, who read the report twice before setting it down. So what you're telling me, she said, is that our president just agreed to a televised sports festival against an empire that treats losing as extinction. That's exactly what I'm telling you, Harrison said. Simmons closed her eyes for a long moment. Then get me everyone who has ever worn a military uniform and also thrown a javelin. We're building a second team. Harrison didn't smile often, but he almost did then. Yes, ma'am. Outside across the country, the Ascension Festival tickets sold out in 11 minutes. Marching bands began rehearsing halftime routines. Sponsors lined up to slap their logos across a stadium built for an event most of them still believed was some kind of interstellar Olympics. Nobody told the cheerleaders what the Drenic Dominion actually did to the losers of their trials, and 7 days was not very long at all. 6 days remained, and the country had officially lost the plot. Every network ran the same footage on a loop. The towering stadium under construction in Colorado, fireworks tested at midnight. A marching band rehearsing a fight song specifically written for the occasion. Meanwhile, 3 floors beneath that same stadium, in a section of the building that did not appear on any public blueprint, Colonel Jake Harrison stood in front of 42 men and women who had absolutely no idea why they had been summoned. They were wrestlers pulled from military athletic programs, former Olympic hopefuls who had also served overseas, a decathlete who had done 2 tours as an Army Ranger, and a linebacker from a college football team who had left school early to enlist. Every single one of them had 2 things in common. They were exceptional athletes, and they knew how to fight for real. Harrison didn't waste time with a speech. He put up a photograph on the screen, an intercepted image from a listening post near the edge of the solar system. It showed a Drenic warrior standing over 7 feet tall, plated in dark armor, holding a weapon that looked like it could cut a truck in half. "This is who we're actually sending you against," Harrison said. "Not a relay race, not a long jump. This." Nobody spoke. Sarah Mitchell, a sprinter who had run for her country before joining the Air Force, finally broke the silence. "The news said this was a festival, sir." "The news is wrong," Harrison said. "And we're not correcting them because if the entire planet panics at the same time, we lose whatever advantage we've got left. You are the real team. The stadium show is cover. You are the actual answer to that message." Major Chris Dalton, the base's combat specialist, stepped forward. He was the one who had spent the last 2 days building the actual strategy, and he laid it out plainly. The Drenic trial grounds operated on rules, ancient and rigid ones, according to every fragment of translated intelligence they had gathered. Multiple events, multiple champions. Strength, speed, endurance, and single combat. Whoever won the majority of events won the trial for their entire species. "That's not just a fight," Dalton said. "That's a full competition." Which means, whether we meant to or not, some of what the public built upstairs might actually help us. Marcus Webb, a former state wrestling champion turned Army combat instructor, raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the fake sports festival accidentally built us the right training ground?" Dalton nodded slowly. "I'm saying we get to use both worlds, their brutality, and our conditioning." For the next 5 days, that underground team trained harder than any group of athletes in human history. Not for medals, not for cameras, for survival. Wrestlers sparred against combat instructors wearing weighted armor to simulate Drenic strength. Sprinters ran obstacle courses under live fire drills. The football player, whose name was Tom Bradley, spent 6 hours a day learning how to redirect a full-grown man twice his size. Because Dalton had a theory that the Drenic fought with pure aggression, and pure aggression could be turned against itself. Above them, the festival prep continued exactly as the public believed it should. Sponsors debated logo placement. A pop star was booked for the opening ceremony. Nobody upstairs knew that 2 floors below their feet, Sarah Mitchell had just been knocked flat on her back by Dalton 3 times in a row and gotten up every single time. On the 4th night, Harrison found her sitting alone outside the training gym, rapping her knuckles. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can find someone else." Sarah looked up at him. "Colonel, I ran track because I loved the feeling of crossing a finish line first. But I joined the Air Force because I wanted to protect something bigger than myself." "This is just a different finish line." Harrison didn't have a response for that. He just nodded once, the way men like him nodded when words weren't going to improve the moment. 2 days later, satellite tracking picked up something entering the edge of the solar system. Something enormous. Dalton was the one who brought the report to Harrison, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. "Sir," he said, "they're early." The Drenic vessel entered Earth's orbit exactly 36 hours ahead of schedule, and for the first time since the crisis began, the entire planet went completely silent. It was not a subtle arrival. The ship stretched nearly 2 miles from end to end, its hull the color of burnt iron, humming with a low vibration that rattled windows from Denver to Salt Lake City. News anchors who had spent a week hyping a festival suddenly found themselves narrating something closer to a funeral broadcast, their voices tight, their scripts abandoned. Inside the underground facility, Harrison called every member of the response team into the briefing room within minutes. They moved up the timeline, he said. That means they either don't trust us, or they're testing us before the actual trial even begins. Dalton pulled up a live feed from a tracking drone near the ship's exterior. A single shuttle detached from the main vessel and began a slow, deliberate descent toward the stadium in Colorado. The same stadium built for a festival that half the underground team now understood was never going to happen the way the public expected. Sanders, the linguist, arrived breathless, clutching a tablet. I intercepted a transmission. They're sending an envoy, not for combat, for introductions. Harrison's jaw tightened. Introductions. Sanders nodded. Their culture apparently requires a formal greeting before any trial can begin. It's tradition. If we insult the greeting, the entire trial is voided, and they interpret a voided trial as forfeiture. Forfeiture meaning what exactly, Harrison asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sanders swallowed, meaning conquest, immediate and total. The shuttle landed in the center of the half-finished stadium exactly as planned, except nothing about the moment felt planned at all. 90,000 seats sat empty, except for a small ring of military personnel and government officials near the field. Fireworks rigs stood silent. The marching band, thankfully, had been sent home an hour earlier under the excuse of a weather delay. The shuttle's ramp lowered with a hiss of steam, and the Drenic envoy stepped out into the open air of Earth for the very first time. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, his armor dark and layered like the plates of some ancient reptile, a long ceremonial blade strapped across his back. His face, visible beneath a raised helmet, was sharp-featured and pale gray, with eyes that scanned the stadium the way a predator studies unfamiliar territory. He introduced himself through a translator device clipped to his chest. I am Envoy Threx of the Drenic Dominion. I have come to witness your preparation. Harrison stepped forward, flanked by Dalton and Sanders, doing his absolute best to look like a man who had not spent the last 6 days training soldiers underground, while the rest of the planet decorated a stadium. Colonel Jake Harrison, he said, representing Earth's forces, we welcome you. Threx's eyes moved slowly across the empty seats, the half-built stage, the abandoned fireworks platform. This is your trial ground, he said. It is not slowly, then rebuilt his sentence carefully through the translator. It does not resemble a place of combat. Harrison felt Sanders tense beside him. This was the moment. The wrong answer here didn't just risk offense. It risked forfeiture. It risked everything. Harrison chose his words the way a man chooses which wire to cut on a bomb. Where we come from, Envoy Threx, greatness is not celebrated in silence. It is celebrated in front of everyone who has something to lose. Every seat in this stadium will be filled with people who believe in our champions. That is not weakness. That is our version of strength. Threx said nothing for a long moment. His translator hummed quietly, almost as if the device itself needed time to process a concept it had never encountered. Then he spoke a single sentence that made Sanders' hand tighten around her tablet. No species has ever brought witnesses to a trial before. Harrison held his ground, even though every instinct in his body screamed to apologize, to backtrack, to explain the misunderstanding before it destroyed them all. Then you're about to see something new, he said. Threx studied him for a long, unreadable moment. Then slowly he turned back toward his shuttle. The trial begins in 1 rotation, he said. Prepare your champions, Colonel Harrison, and prepare your witnesses, because if your champions fall, the witnesses will fall with them. The ramp closed. The shuttle lifted into the sky and vanished back toward the massive ship above. Harrison stood in the center of the empty stadium, 90,000 seats staring back at him, and understood with total clarity that tomorrow the whole planet's fate would be decided in front of an audience that did not yet know it was watching a war. The stadium filled to capacity before sunrise. 90,000 people packed into seats that had been sold as tickets to a celebration, wrapped in team colors, waving flags. Completely unaware that the event they were about to witness carried the full weight of humanity's survival. Vendors sold popcorn near tunnels where combat medics stood by, with equipment built for battlefield trauma. A brass band played warm-up songs 50 feet from where Colonel Jake Harrison gave his team their final briefing. "This is real," he told them one last time. "Whatever happens out there today, the people in these seats are counting on you even if they don't know it. Make it count." Marcus Webb adjusted the wraps on his hands. Sarah Mitchell laced her boots tight enough to cut off circulation. Tom Bradley rolled his shoulders like he was about to take the field for a championship game, because in every way that mattered, he was. At exactly 9 in the morning, the sky above the stadium tore open with light, and the Drennick shuttle descended onto the field in front of 90,000 people who had absolutely no idea what they were looking at until the massive armored figures began stepping out of it. The crowd noise died in an instant. 90,000 people who thought they were watching a festival suddenly realized, all at once, that they were watching something else entirely. Somewhere in the upper seats, a child asked her mother why the visitors looked like they were dressed for war. Nobody answered her. Envoy Threx walked to the center of the field, flanked by 3 Drennick champions, each easily 7 feet tall, their armor catching the morning light like polished stone. Threx raised a device and his translated voice boomed across every speaker in the stadium. "The trial of ascension begins. 4 events determine the fate of your species: strength, speed, endurance, and single combat. Your champions will face mine, win the majority, and your world stands free." The first event was strength, and the Drennick champion chosen for it stepped forward carrying a stone pillar easily the size of a small car. He hurled it nearly 40 feet with a single motion, and the ground shook when it landed. Marcus Webb walked out to face him, and for one terrible second, the entire stadium held its breath. Webb didn't try to match the throw with pure force. He'd spent 5 days training exactly for this. He used leverage, technique, and the exact kind of controlled explosive power that had made him a state wrestling champion before he ever put on a uniform. He didn't throw the stone as far. He threw it accurately, landing it inside a marked zone the Drennick champion had missed entirely. Threx's translator crackled. Accuracy is honored equally to distance under ancient rule. The crowd, uncertain if they were allowed to celebrate, erupted anyway, 90,000 voices roaring at once, and something strange happened on the Drennick champion's face. Something that looked almost like confusion. He had never heard cheering before. The second event was speed, a sprint across the open field against a Drennick champion whose stride alone covered nearly twice the distance of a human's. Sarah Mitchell lined up beside him, smaller, lighter, and completely unshaken. The starting signal fired, and the alien launched forward with terrifying power, pulling ahead within the first 10 strides. But Sarah had spent years of her life perfecting acceleration, and the last 100 meters of any race had always belonged to her. As the alien began to tire from raw effort rather than efficient form, she closed the gap stride by stride, the crowd noise building into something that shook the stadium's foundation, until she crossed the line a full half-second ahead. The Drennick champion staggered to a stop, staring at her, then staring at the crowd screaming her name, as if trying to understand why 90,000 strangers cared this much about one person's victory. Humanity led 2 events to none. Threx's expression, for the first time, shifted from unreadable to something that looked almost like concern. The third event was endurance, and it broke people. A punishing obstacle course had been built overnight along the outer ring of the stadium, filled with barriers no human engineer had designed, but every Drennick body seemed built for. Tom Bradley faced it against a Drennick champion built like a walking mountain, someone whose stamina, according to Sanders' intelligence briefings, had never once failed across 100 recorded trials. Bradley started strong, matching pace for the first 2 miles, but by the third, the alien's raw physical advantage began to show. He pulled ahead by nearly a full lap, and for a moment it looked like humanity's perfect start was about to crack. Then the crowd did something nobody expected. They started chanting his name. It began in one section, then spread, 90,000 voices rising together in a single rhythmic wave of sound that rolled across the field like thunder. Bradley heard it, felt it in his chest, and something in him refused to let it fade into silence. He found a second gear he didn't know existed, closing the gap through the final stretch, and though he crossed the line seconds behind the Drenic champion, the difference was smaller than anyone believed possible. Threx studied the scoreboard, 2 events to 1. The final event remains, single combat determines all. The stadium went dead silent as the final Drenic champion stepped forward, easily the largest of the 3. His armor scarred from what Sanders would later confirm were 43 previous trials. None of them lost. Colonel Harrison looked at his team. There was no obvious answer here. No amount of athletic conditioning fully prepared a human body to trade blows with something built like living armor. Then Marcus Webb stepped forward, the same wrestler who had opened the day with the strength event. "I've got this one," he said quietly. The fight began without ceremony. The Drenic champion moved with terrifying speed for his size, closing distance in an instant, throwing strikes that could have ended the match in a single connection. Webb didn't try to trade power. He used everything Dalton had drilled into him for 5 straight days, technique built specifically to turn an opponent's aggression into their own downfall. He slipped strikes by inches, used the champion's own forward momentum against him, and worked toward the one advantage humans had refined for thousands of years, grappling. It took nearly 4 minutes, an eternity in combat terms, but Webb finally locked in a hold the Drenic anatomy had apparently never been trained to counter. A joint control technique that no opponent had ever attempted against them, because no opponent had ever needed to think that small. The Drenic champion tapped the ground, the universal signal for surrender, translated instantly by the device on his chest. The stadium exploded into sound unlike anything the planet had ever produced, 90,000 voices screaming at once. But Threx stood motionless at the center of the field, staring not at the defeated champion, but at the crowd itself. "You did not fight alone," he said, his translator carrying the words across the silence that followed as the noise finally settled. "Every champion of my people fights in isolation. Victory belongs to them alone, as does defeat. Your champions fought with an entire world screaming behind them." Harrison stepped forward carefully. "That's not a weakness, Envoy Threx. That's the whole point." Threx said nothing for a long moment, studying the scoreboard, studying the crowd, studying the 4 humans standing exhausted but upright in the center of the field. Envoy Threx raised his hand, and the stadium fell silent once more, 90,000 people holding their breath together for the second time that day. "The trial belongs to Earth," he announced, his translated voice echoing across every speaker in the stadium. 3 victories of 4. "By ancient law, your world stands free of Drenic claim, now and for all future cycles." The eruption of noise that followed was unlike anything the planet had ever recorded. A roar that rolled outward from Colorado and seemed to travel through television screens into homes across every continent, where people had spent the entire day watching in terrified silence, only now understanding exactly how close they had come to losing everything. Harrison allowed himself, for the first time in 8 days, one long breath of pure relief, but Threx was not finished. He studied the 4 exhausted champions standing before him, then turned to face Harrison directly, his translator carrying words that would echo across galactic records for generations to come. "In 300 cycles of trials," he said, "no species has ever brought an audience to witness their champions. We fight alone because strength, to us, has always meant standing without support. Today I watched strength mean something different. I watched an entire world stand behind 4 people, and I watched those 4 people fight as though that support made them unstoppable rather than weak." He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying across 90,000 seats and through broadcast signals across the entire planet. "Perhaps," he said, "the Drenic Dominion has misunderstood strength for longer than we realized." He bowed once, a gesture Sanders later confirmed had never been recorded in any prior Drenic interaction with another species, and returned to his shuttle without another word. The massive ship above the planet remained in orbit for exactly 1 more hour. then turned and vanished back into the darkness beyond the solar system, carrying with it a story that would spread across a dozen star systems long before humanity ever built its first working starship. In the weeks that followed, the truth eventually came out, quietly at first, then completely. The public learned that the Ascension Festival had never been a festival at all, that the athletes they had cheered for were trained soldiers who had spent 5 brutal days preparing for something far more serious than medals. Rather than outrage, the reaction was something closer to pride. News networks replayed Marcus Webb's final match more times than any sporting event in history. Sarah Mitchell became the most recognized name in the country, not for the medals she never actually won, but for the half-second that had determined the fate of a planet. Colonel Jake Harrison never did enjoy the spotlight, but he stood beside his team at the official ceremony held 3 weeks later, watching 4 ordinary people, and understood, more clearly than he had ever understood anything in his career, that survival had never come down to weapons or technology. It came down to people who refused to fight alone, in front of people who refused to stop cheering for them. Dr. Emily Sanders would spend the rest of her career studying Drenic communications, and years later, she would discover something that made her sit alone in her office for a long time. Buried within a compressed archive of translated Drenic history, there was a new entry, added after the Ascension trial, describing a concept the Drenic language had never possessed before. Roughly translated, it read, "The strength found in numbers who choose to stand together." They had given it a name. In their language, it translated most closely to one simple human word: team. Somewhere above the planet, a message was already spreading outward through Drenic communication channels, carried to every world under Dominion influence, a warning wrapped inside a legend. Do not challenge the small blue world circling a yellow star. They do not fight to win, they fight for each other, and somehow that has always been stronger. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next battle. Drop a comment and let me know which moment hit hardest for you, the strength event, the sprint, or that final match that decided everything. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that we are always stronger together. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.